Welcome back, guys. We're in part two, renewing the sectional struggle in the United States. We talked in the first lesson about sectionalism. Now, to remember what sectionalism is, I want you to pause the video for just a moment, and I want you to think about sectionalism. And maybe you need to turn to your person to your left or the person to your right and ask them, hey, what is sectionalism? Remind me what that is all about. So go ahead and pause now and talk about that with your friend or with your neighbor. Okay, welcome back. So sectionalism, as you know, is where the United States began to vote based on where they lived in the country. So people in the North voted one way, and people in the South voted another way, and people out West actually also voted based on this issue of slavery. People moved out west, including Kansas and Nebraska, and that's what we're going to talk about today. They moved into Kansas and Nebraska because it's all this land, and they want to move into this land because it's free land or really cheap, and they want to build a life for themselves. Now, can you imagine if you're moving into new land and you're looking for a job, and this new territory in Kansas and Nebraska is open for slavery? You're going to be competing against people who are working for free. Slaves, of course, worked for free. On this first slide, we see a picture of a cartoon of Kansas and Nebraska. And the idea here is that they're shoving the views of one group of people down the throats of another group of people, even though they did not want to share those views. And that's what happens with Kansas and Nebraska. Now, let's take Nebraska off the table right away. We say off the table means we don't really have to think about it. So I can explain this one very quickly, and then we can just really focus on Kansas. So Nebraska is too far to the north to have attracted very many plantation owners and slave owners. No one really thought there was going to be much growth of slavery in Nebraska. And so the question really was about Kansas. Should Kansas have slaves, or should Kansas not have slaves? And so there was a law passed called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. An act is a law. And in this law, it stated that the people of Kansas could vote whether or not they wanted to have slavery. And so they set a day for the election, and they were going to vote in that territory, yes, to have slaves, or no, not to have slaves. And so here's the thing. On this slide that we see Kansas Bleeding Kansas, and that's what it was called because there was so much bloodshed on and after Election Day. So the question is, how many settlers required in a territory to apply for statehood? 60,000. So there's not 60,000 yet in Kansas. You only must have 5,000 to become a territory, an organized territory. Now, where are most of the Kansas and Nebraska settlers coming from? Well, they're not coming from California, they're not coming from Texas, and they're not coming from Canada. They're coming from the east, and many of them are coming from kind of the southeast and the northeast. Now, the northeastern settlers, they're moving in, and they already are against slavery. The southeasterners are coming in, and they're already for slavery. And so you now have people living in Kansas who are both for and against slavery, and they're going to vote. And how is this going to work out? So at the bottom of the picture here, we see, at the bottom of slide of Kansas Bleeding Kansas, we see a picture of a painting, a drawing of John Brown, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a moment. So in 1854, and this is a similar map as we saw in the last video lesson, 1854, this is what the United States looks like. We see the Kansas Territory, and we see Nebraska there. Now, Kansas Bleeding Kansas. Now, this is a major moment in American history, and this is not a long video lesson, but I'm taking one whole lesson to talk about Kansas Bleeding Kansas because it's so important in kind of symbolically in American history in the 1850s. Lots of things are happening in the 1850s. We're going to talk about more of them in the next lesson, in the next chapter, but this one is important. So if we're looking at the slide that says as many as 20,000 pro-slavers came from Missouri. Now let's look back at the slide previous to this one. You can see that Missouri is the green state just on the right side or the east side of the Kansas Territory. So as many as 20,000 people that were in favor, that wanted slavery, traveled from Missouri to vote for slavery in March of 1855. Now, in the United States, you can only vote in your home state, the state where you live. And so I live in Tennessee, and I can vote in Tennessee. I cannot vote in California. I cannot vote in Florida or Texas or New York. Now, before, when I lived in New York, I can vote in New York. But I cannot vote in Tennessee then because I did not live in Tennessee. I lived in New York. And it's not like China where your hometown is always your hometown and you're tied to that place. Of course, I'm tied to my hometown, but I can vote anywhere I live, but I can only vote one time. And so in this case, what these people were doing was against the law. They were moving from Missouri only to vote. And then after they voted, they would go back to Missouri. And Missouri is a slave state, which means that the people coming from Missouri are voting for slavery. And that's the question. The vote was, do you want slavery or do you not want slavery? And so people from Missouri are coming over 20,000 and voting for slavery. And so how do you think the vote turned out? Well, they went pro-slavery. And in Lawrence, Kansas, it's a town in Kansas, people that were called free staters, they were against slavery in Kansas. They took up weapons and they began to protest and they began to fight with the people that were pro-slavers, and they burned buildings. And on May 21, 1856, the town of Lawrence, Kansas was burned and destroyed, or we would say sacked. So this moment, May 21, 1856, sets off a chain of events over the next 2 or 3 years, coming up to 1860 and 61, when Lincoln is elected and when the American Civil War begins, that continually move us on the path toward war. And Kansas, bloody Kansas, is one of those, is kind of the beginning of that march toward Civil War. So, and that's what we're going to talk about today, but I do want you to remember and think about 1854, Kansas, bloody Kansas, and sectionalism from the last lesson. Okay, we'll see you guys next time. Have a good week. Bye-bye.